Hi there. In the last session, we saw about 3 examples of some small shell scripts. We also saw that it is not only writing shell scripts, we should also do unit testing of the shell scripts, and we should ensure that our code is very logical. Now, this tells you the importance of writing commands in the code also. So, were you able to debug the last shell script? If you have not, please try to debug and try to identify where the problem is. Now, we will move on to the next topic, which is how to write functions within a shell script. Now, there is a confusion between whether we should call them as functions or we should call them as procedures. Formally in computer science, a function is defined to be y is equal to f of x, which means for every value of x you have a defined value of y. So, in that sense a function returns a single value, whereas a procedure does not return any value, but may produce some sort of output. Okay. The reason why we have termed it as shell functions or shell procedures or whatever it is, and whatever you feel convenient you call them, but we will in this course we will call them as shell functions, and a shell function may do neither, either or both. So, let us call them as functions for the time being. Okay. So, what are all the things that a shell function can do? The first thing a shell function can do is it can change the state of a variable or variables. Now, this is true in any shell script. Okay. So, if you have a shell variable, you can either add something to the variable or you can display the variable, etc. Similarly, a function can exit from a shell, and third, most importantly, a function can also return values back, and these values, the return values can be used by the calling section of the shell script. Now, why is it necessary to have functions? It is always better that a long shell script or a very big shell script is divided into modules. When I say divided into modules, I do not mean that you take a 1000 line shell script and every 10 lines you make it as a function. Every function should do a particular job or must have a single responsibility. If you write a shell script, a very large shell script which runs to thousands of lines of code, it is better you modularize the shell script and make it into smaller components such that a person who is reading the shell script or who is trying to use the shell script understands what you want to do. This is essentially one of the reasons why you have a function in a shell script. Okay. Now, let us directly dive into an example, and we will see the various ways of returning from a function and how to use the return value of functions and so on. We will see this using some examples. So, let us see this example function.sh. Okay, so, we will have 2 or 3 versions of the functions, okay, and we will be using the same function, same example that we used in the last session. In the last session, we were trying to add 2 integers. What we will do now is, we will the same shell script, we will try to make it as a function. So, a function definition in shell script consists of the function name. Okay, this is the function name. The function name that I have given is add underscore 2 underscore numbers underscore var1. That is essentially I am calling this as version 1. And after this you open and close a brace, okay, curved brace, okay, and then you start with a curly brace. Now, this is similar to the way you write a function in C, in the sense that you use the same curly braces here. Okay. And after this you can write your logic. So, if you remember the example that we had seen in the last class, we had first tried to see whether the number of parameters, okay, that are passed to the function is correct, okay. That is what we are checking at this line, and then if the parameters are not okay, at an example of how to write a function. So, in this case if you look at this, at line number 3 we actually define a function. Every function has a function name, okay. Unfortunately in shell script you do not pass parameters within this curved braces. What we actually do is we pass parameters as we usually pass the parameters in shell, that is something like this. You give the command name and then after that give a space and then pass the parameters. The same convention must be followed for the functions also when you are calling the function. This is the function definition, and in this definition of a function what we are doing is we are initially trying to see whether the number of input parameters is 2. If it is not 2, then we give the usage example, and if it is true then we calculate the value of the function, okay, the parameters that are passed, and then print it. Now this is known as a function definition, and in line number 20 we have something known as the function call, okay. If you see the names, it is the same, add underscore 2 underscore numbers underscore var1, and next to it I am passing 2 parameters, that is 5 and 5, which essentially means when this function, when the shell comes to the shell script comes to line number 20 and it executes this line, what it does, it actually calls this function. So once it calls this function, the first line that will be executed is it tries to check whether the number of parameters that you pass is actually 2. If the input parameters is 2, then it actually calculates the value and prints this. So let us see the first version whether it works correctly, okay. And if you look at number 1, number 2, number 3, these are used for the next version, next other 2 versions of the function. So let us not worry about line number 16, 17 and 18 currently. What we will be worried about is line numbers 3 to 14 and then line number 20. Let us see how this works. So what I expect is that first it should print sum of $1 plus and $2, which is nothing but sum of 5 plus 5 is 10. So what happens is that this is known as the function call, where I use the function name and along with the function name I pass the parameters. If you remember in the previous session, instead of calling this as add underscore 2 underscore numbers underscore var1, we had called it as example 2.sh, and in the same way we have passed the parameters in the same way. So the way you pass the parameters to the function call is similar to the way you pass parameters to the, for invoking the shell scripts. So let us see what happens. We will execute up to line 20. Of course this is going to execute all the other lines also, but we will see what happens when we come to line 20. So line 20 should print that the value is the sum of 5 plus 5 is 10. Let us look at this, and if you see it prints the sum of 5 plus 5 is 10. Now what is unique about this function? One, it does not return any value, okay. What it does is it just takes parameters, input parameters, and then prints the results of the input parameters. So in that sense, should we really call it as a function? So we should call it as a procedure. So that is what we had seen as a definition previously. That apart, let us come back, okay, and let us look at the second version of the function, okay. So here I am using the same name, add 2 numbers, except that I change it as version 2, and the difference here in this is the way I call this function. If you look at this function, if you look at line number 31, what I had done is I had declared variables in line number 16, 17 and 18, num1, num2 and num3, and what I do is in line number 35 I actually give num1 is equal to 5 and num2 is equal to 7, and you see one of the things is before you use the function you should define it in shell, okay. So that is one of the conventions that you should follow, otherwise it, I mean first thing is it confuses the user if you use something like this without defining it, okay. So what we do is we actually have this definition of the function which is add underscore 2 underscore numbers version 2, and in this case if you see we had initialized the variable number 3 to 0 and we are changing the value of number 3 inside the function. This is known as side effects, Such kind of programming is extremely dangerous, but I think you should leave such things. A shell script allows you such things, but be very careful when you use such kind of side effects. Now, in this case what we do is we just pass parameters num1 and num2 instead of the values 5 and 5. So, what we do is we assign the value of num1 to be 5, num2 to be 7, and then we pass the parameters as num1 and num2, and we do the calculation inside the function, and but we print the result outside the function. So, this is another way of using a function. So, in this case let us say the number that should be printed is 12. So, what happens is when the shell comes to execution of this, it actually calls this function, okay, and once it calls this function, all these lines are executed and your value will be printed. So, let us try to see whether this happens. So, the values that were given are 7 and 5. So, it should print a value of 12. So, it says value of sum is 12 if you look at the second line that is printed. What we can do is we can also see whether by using the debugging whether such a thing happens. So, if you look at this, if you look at the place where we assign the values, we assign the value of num1 to be 5 and num2 to be 7, then it calls the function call, okay, add two numbers version 2, and we are passing num1 and num2, then it compares whether the arguments, number of arguments are 2. So, then what it does is if it takes this num1 takes the value of 5 here and num2 takes the value of 7. So, when I calculate the expression of 5 plus 7, it gives 12, which is assigned to num3, and what we do is at this point the function ends execution, and what we are happening is that the echo statement comes after this function, but this occurs in the main shell script that we are using. So, what happens in a shell script is whenever you do a function call, and this is similar in the first case too. See, in the very first case where we had discussed giving add two numbers version 1 with 5 and 5, okay, what had happened was, if you look at this, let us look at this. So, if you look at this, we see that it tried to check whether there were two parameters, and after this the function, actually the shell script actually called the function call, and inside the function call we were doing the addition of 5 plus 5, and then we echoed this saying that 5 plus 5 is 10, which was from the shell script. Okay. So, there are two aspects here, one the shell script that calls the function, and the other aspect the execution inside the function. Now, let us take a look at the next example. So, if you look at this third example, what we are doing here is we are working on something which is slightly different. If you look at the difference between the previous version of the function and this version. So, as I told you, you should not allow side effects. Side effects are extremely dangerous in programming. So, what I do is I actually, if you look at this line number 50, I told you that a definition of a function should return a value. So, in this case what we do is we actually declare the variable num3 and return its value explicitly. And now, this is a better method of coding rather than using side effects. Okay. And once we return this value, what happens is that now, if you remember in our previous session we are told that a return value of any function can be caught by using this variable $question mark. Now, that is exactly what we are doing right here. Since it returns the value of number 3, we are actually printing the value of number 3 using $question mark. So, this is another way of returning a value from a function. So, if you look at this, okay, and let us try to execute it before we move on to the other parts. So, let us try to execute this function. If you look at this, we are passing the values as 7 and 9, okay, and then we are using add two numbers version 3 with the inputs of number 1 and number 2, which are nothing but 7 and 9. Then it tests for whether the operands the number of parameters are okay. Then what it does is it adds 9 plus 7, which is 16, and it assigns to number 3, and then what we do is we return the 16, that is dollar number 3 is what we return, and once we echo this, the echo statement prints 16 here. So, in this way, if you look at our presentation, we had said that we can change the state of a variable, we can use the exit command to shell the shell script, okay, and we can use the return command to end the function. So, the return value supplied to the calling section of the shell script is what we are printing. Until now we have used a shell script which called a function. Now, is it possible that the function can call itself? Yes, such functions are called recursive functions. Now, how are we going to use recursive functions? Well, I mean, we can only show some examples, and how we apply it to your Unix operating system depends on the task at hand. So, what we are demonstrating here is the kind of facilities that are provided by the shell scripts in order to achieve your task. These are all set of tools, but how you use the tools is left to your intelligence. So, what is recursion? A recursion informally can be called as a function calling itself. What we will do is we will see how recursion operates and how we can write recursive programs using shell. Let us look at this function called recursion.sh. Now, what we are doing is we are writing a very small shell program to get the factorial of a number. Of course, there are very many efficient algorithms to get the factorial of a number, but what we are trying to do is we are trying to just demonstrate the calculation of recursion. So, in this case what we do is we first define the function called factorial. I hope you are very familiar with the way we call functions. Okay. So, what I do is if then this factorial function actually expects a number to be input. So, that is what it says, and then you can call this function with a given number. Now, what happens once it comes to this line, it actually calls the factorial function, okay, and then if you the $x becomes $1, okay, and if the given number is greater than 1, because if the given number is 1, okay, then I say the factorial is 1 and come out of this program. So, once it comes, if this else part is executed, then finally there is nothing, therefore, this program comes out. So, where is this recursion used? If you remember, we have a command in Linux which is ls space minus l capital R. This capital R actually tells you that you have to go a directory within directories and then find out, list out all the files. So, this is an example of recursion where a system call calls itself, but only thing that is different is the parameter that you pass. So, similarly in this case, in this example, if you see, what we do is we have to call factorial, which is a function that we have already defined, and we understand how to define a function in the previous few minutes. We understood how to define a function. What we do here is we pass parameters to the function, which here $x is the parameter, $x is the value that you read from the user here. So, if this value is 1, the logic says that if this value is 1, whatever is 1, then you have to return the value of 1 to the user. If the value is greater than 1, then the first thing that I do is I just decrease the value by 1. So, let us assume that I give a value of 2, then I make I to be 2 minus 1, that is 1, and then inside I catch the factorial of 1, which means this function will again be called. Okay. Once this function gets called, then factorial of 1 is 1, okay, and this value, okay, so j will become 1. So, at that point in time, so what we do is the next line gets executed, okay, and here what happens is this 1 gets multiplied by whatever number you had given, which is 2, and then finally the result is presented as 2. So, let us see how recursion works in this case. What we are going to do is first let us apply the value of, let us try to give values of 1, 2 and 3 and then see how recursion works. So, suppose I give factorial of 1. So, what happens is that the $1 here becomes 1. So, 1 is greater than 1 is false, therefore, I execute echo is equal to 1. So, what you see on the screen is it will print a value of 1. Let us give a value of 2. So, in this case what happens is the first line inside the if statement will reduce the value of 2 to 1, because then I will become 1, and then it will call factorial of 1. So, once it call, we know that the factorial of 1 will return a value of 1, which is j, and so k will calculate the value of $1, which is nothing but, what is the value of $1 is 1 into j. Okay, j is nothing but the value that you have calculated here. Okay. And what happens is that here it will calculate 2 into 1, which gives a value of 2, and then it exists. Let us see the execution here. So, I put sh minus x recursion dot sh. So, I will give a value of 2. So, if you look at this, it first calls factorial of 2, and then I gets a value of 1, then it calls factorial of 1, okay, and then what happens is that then I returns the value of this factorial returns a value of 1, that means j returns a value of 1, then I multiply this 2 by 1, the previous value of 1, so therefore the value becomes 2. Let us try to do the same thing with the value of 3. So, once I put a value of 3, what happens here is I call factorial of 3, then I becomes value of 2, then it calls factorial of 2, factorial of 2 actually calls factorial of 1, and factorial of 1 returns 1, which is multiplied by 2, okay, and then factorial of 2 returns 2, which is again multiplied by 3, and finally you have 3 into 2 into 1, the value is 6, and finally it echoes a value of 6. Now, you can see that you should spend a lot of time to debug this, because recursion is slightly confusing. It is easier to code, but difficult to debug. Okay. Recursion in general is a function calling itself on a problem of a smaller size. So, in this case, if you look at this, factorial of 3 actually calls factorial of 2. So, factorial of 2 is a smaller problem than factorial of 3. Similarly, factorial of 2 is calling factorial of 1. Now, how this whole thing is handled is it makes use of a stack to store the local variables, and then it pops out the stacks once the recursion ends and all those things. Let us not worry about all those aspects of how a recursion is implemented. What we will discuss is how to code programs using recursion. This is when you have recursive code, the code will be slightly shorter. The another way of, and this example of factorial is known as tail recursion, and there is a proof that any tail recursion can be converted into a for loop or a do while loop. So, and coding using do while loop is much more easier, but we just wanted to show you that A, shell scripts allow you to define functions, and B, you could also call recursive functions. You should try to practice recursive functions. There are a lot of examples like tree traversal and things like that, but probably you should try to write 1 or 2 recursive functions to gain expertise on or to see how shell scripting works. Thank you.